Welcome to Food Talk for Health, because you really are what you eat. Here is your host, Tonia King.
My guest today is New York Times bestselling author, journalist Dan Buettner. We're talking about the brand new book, The Blue Zones, American Kitchen. Thanks for joining me, Dan.
It's a delight.
The Blue Zones have always fascinated me, especially because of my Italian heritage and kind of living that way growing up. And, the first book that you did was fascinating because I always thought about how, you talked about Sardinia in Italy, you talked about Greece, Okinawa, and how in the world did they get to Loma Linda from there?
Loma Linda is a concentration of Seventh-day Adventists, and they conservative Christians, but they eat a biblical diet. They take their diet directly from the Bible, Genesis chapter 1.
Wow.
God basically talks about the Garden of Eden. Every plant that bears seed, so that's nuts and beans and legumes, and every tree that bears fruit, which of course is citrus and apples and avocados, tomatoes, etc. And they actually follow that. So, the average American could live an extra 10 years if they were eating a whole food plant-based diet over eating a standard American diet. And the Adventists were doing it, and so were people in all the other blue zones in Sardinia, mostly a plant-based diet.
I'm fascinated by why you decided to then dig into the American kitchen.
A few years ago, I wrote The Blue Zones Kitchen, which was the worldwide diet of longevity, and it was a #1 New York Times bestseller. And I thought, well, why reinvent the wheel? So then I tried to find cultures of longevity in America and ended up backing into it, spending 150 hours going through dietary surveys at NYU. And we found that among African Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, and Native Americans, around the turn of the last century, we're eating almost a dead ringer for a blue zone diet. So National Geographic photographer David McLean and I, during the pandemic, traveled from Maine to Miami to Maui up to Minnesota, found 55 of the best chefs in America who knew how to take these heirloom recipes, this traditional way of eating, and bring it to life in a way that, your average, housewife in Iowa could cook this food and make it taste delicious.
The recipes are fascinating and really interesting. And I got a kick out of the fact that you said your dad, who's a meat and potatoes kind of guy, recipe tested everything. That's incredible.
Yeah. Well, Roger Buettner, 87 years old, grew up on a Minnesota farm milking cows. And I knew, I'm a plant-based and I haven't eaten meat in 8 years. So I knew the recipes had to appeal not just to me, but also to sort of average eater in America. And my dad represented that, and he came with. And if he gave the recipe a thumb down, it did not make the book. So every recipe in here is Roger Buettner thumbs up.
That's great. Can we talk about a couple of those recipes? Can you share one or two with us? What are some of your favorites?
Yes. So I'm a big fan of one-pot meals because people are busy. And there's so much genius. We found these Gullah Geechee people in the Carolinas and Georgia, descendants of African slaves, who fused their West African traditions with Native American tradition. The word gumbo, we tend to think of it with New Orleans, but actually it's a West African word meaning okra. And there's this fabulous okra stews that have searing hot peppers and acid from a little bit of local vinegar and sesame seeds for umami. And, you can find all these ingredients. It takes 20 minutes to assemble them, and you take a spoonful of it and you cry tears of joy. That's one of my faves.
Wow. And you also talk about how beans are really an important part of the diet.
Yes. So when you do a meta-analysis, look at what 100-year-olds in 5 locations around the world have eaten to live to 100. You see they're eating about a cup of beans a day, not just straight, but in their foods.
Right.
And if you can manage to get a cup of beans in your diet every day, it probably adds 4 years to your life expectancy. You get about half of all your fiber needs just in one fell swoop with those beans alone. They're cheap. And, as long as you know how to make them taste delicious. Americans aren't very good at making beans taste delicious, which is why I put a pretty heavy emphasis, a whole section in this book on fabulous beans.
And it's not just one type of bean, right? We're talking pinto beans, cannellini beans, northern beans, all beans.
any kind of beans. I have this Dave Smoke McCulloch, and actually an Apache chef, who showed us how to make these Mohawk beans, which have a little bit of maple syrup in there, a little bit of mustard, I believe, but just a little bit for flavor. And man, I'll tell you what, those beans jump off the plate like a Mardi Gras party, and they're delicious, a hint of sweetness, and easy to make. And if you can get those into your diet, it's about probably the best superfood you can invest in.
I think I also remember reading something about Fort Worth. You mentioned Fort Worth being a
Yes.
big area.
So, well, my daytime job, I get paid by insurance companies. My company gets paid by insurance companies and hospital systems to bring the Blue Zone's approach to cities to lower obesity, lower chronic disease, and thus raise their life expectancy. And Fort Worth hired us to come in. We brought our team in for 5 years, not trying to change people's mind, because nobody can agree on diet for the most part. But we help change policies. We certify restaurants, grocery stores, workplaces, and schools, and got about 15% of the population to take a Blue Zone pledge to shape their immediate surroundings. And we managed to lower the obesity rate there in Fort Worth. It went up in the rest of Texas. In Fort Worth, it went down by 3%, occasioning about $250 million a year in healthcare cost savings. So since then, we've now been working in 71 American cities. It's called the Blue Zones Project, and I'm just the founder. We have 150 really capable full-time people who execute on it.
How exciting. We're talking about the Blue Zones American Kitchen with Dan Buettner. Do you have another recipe that you might tease us with? Heard about your Hoppin' John recipe.
Hoppin' John. So, I mean, this is it. People are obsessed with protein in America. But if you look at the CDC website, you'll see that the average American gets twice the protein that they need. But nevertheless, I wanted to make sure there were protein-rich recipes. And whenever you have a rice and a bean, you don't even have to eat them at the same time during the day, but together, they give you all the amino acids necessary for human sustenance. They're full of fiber, a whole protein, so to speak. So the Hoppin' John, another recipe originated by African Americans. It's a celebratory food on New Year's. Mostly beans and rice, and but they gussy it up so it tastes delicious. And once again, this is another manifestation of the healthiest foods throughout history have been peasant foods that poor people have eaten every day. But they like to eat delicious food as much as everybody else. So there are literally hundreds of years of observed trial and error to make these recipes here taste delicious. And the taste, I think, is the most important ingredient in any longevity recipe. Because if you're not going to eat it for a long time, it doesn't do any good for you. There's no pill, there's no supplement, there's no genetic intervention that exists right now. But to get that extra 10 years, you learn how to make plant-based food taste delicious. Learn how to do it. Most of the time, all you need is an Instapot or a crock pot, and get in the habit of doing it every day. And your chance of disease plummet, and your life expectancy soars.
Boy, Dan, you are on a mission to help us definitely feel better and stay healthy. How do we get the general public to really buy into it and really, get on board?
Here's an actionable idea. This year, about January 1st, right around the corner, about 80 million Americans will do New Year's resolutions. Half of them will be off that resolution by January 19th. Instead of getting on that monkey wheel again, get a book like the Blue Zone American Kitchen. Doesn't have to be my book. There's lots of great whole plant-based cookbooks. Page through it with your family. Identify a dozen recipes and cook 3 of them a week for January. I guarantee you, after those 12 recipes, you'll find a handful that you love. And after that, my job is over. You know how to cook it, you know how to shop for it, and you know your family loves it. It's the best thing you can do for your family. And once you identify tasty food, it becomes a long-term habit. I found a recipe in Sardinia, minestrone. I eat it every day for breakfast. I turn off my brain, start my day with that. I get all the fiber I need and most of the micronutrients. It costs me about $1 a serving.
How can we follow you and learn more about the Blue Zones American Kitchen?
So thank you. At Dan Buettner on Instagram. And I answer all my questions. So if you direct message me, I'll answer. I have new longevity tips every day. The Blue Zones American Kitchen, I like to think it's literally a gift of life this holiday season. That's on Amazon or at my website, danbuettner.com. And thank you very much.
I really appreciate your time today, Dan. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Food Talk for Health with Tonia King. Thanks for joining us. Eat well to be well.
Please check out our new podcast for Food Talk for Health wherever you get your podcasts from.